Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we will be talking about how cultures impact your organization's health and what you can do about it. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Sophie Theen. Welcome, Sophie.
Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm really excited to be on the show today.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. Can you share with the audience a little bit about your background?
Yeah, of course. So I started off as an engineer and then very quickly was a short-lived engineer and then very quickly moved into HR and recruitment and eventually found myself kind of building out people strategies, talent strategies in the world of startups. And I've been in the startup space for about 8 years now. I currently do advisory for early stage, including seeding stage startups to help businesses and also coach founders to build more sustainable businesses.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, culture is obviously a really important topic, and it starts from the beginning in the startup phase all the way until it's a large organization. And would just love to hear a little bit about what attracted you to that field, and why you find it to be so important.
Yeah. So because I've always had a career working with people very directly, especially when you're working in a people position or in HR, you often find that there are people problems within an organization that limits an organization scale. And over the experience of my career, I've also realized that a lot of these things actually stem from the top. And this is why I've kind of done a lot of research to put together a book that's also really kind of emphasizing the effect of founders on our culture in our companies. And so, really, in answering your question, what excited me in this space the most is trying to figure out the right kind of dynamic to help organizations build better relationships with their people to ultimately then, create better products, serve our customers better, because ultimately that's the whole ambition of the companies, right? Except that they don't always realize that it's the people that actually makes or break the company.
And so how does the founder, like, as the corporation grows and, maybe reaching 100 people, how is it that the founder's influence continues to have influence on the culture?
Yeah. So actually, throughout the entire life cycle of the company, as the organization grows through various of stages, the founders will always ultimately have an impact on the culture culture in the business. What really is the difference here is when the company is a lot smaller, the founders have a direct impact because you would normally expect to see a smaller layer of secondary managers or executive team. And as the company gets a little bit bigger, you'll start to see, a formation of your senior managers to kind of take shape. You'll have a slightly different kind of grouping in the executive team when it starts to be a little bit bigger. And every single person in the organization as a manager, if not senior manager, starts to take ownership of their own verticals, if not streams. And so then you kind of see that throughout this evolution, the impact of a founder towards a culture becomes less and less critical. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely taken away from on the shaping of the culture of a business. So that's really important to also remember.
And so how does that change? I mean, what is the level of impact, I suppose, in a smaller organization versus as it grows? I mean, I know you just talked about the evolution of you get layers, but is it that as the organization grows that the founder maybe loses control of the culture, or is there still a level of influence that they can have, whether positive or negative, and whether intentional or unintentional once the organization grows?
Yeah, so you completely described it exactly the way that I've seen it, right? As the company starts to grow a lot bigger, the impact becomes smaller. So just going back to in the early stage when your business is a lot smaller, the impact from a founder's influence in the culture is quite direct, given the fact that there isn't a layer to kind of give that breathing space, or if not, take that particular problem or impact away and actually put it into a slightly different perception. And so what it means is if a founder intentionally or unintentionally, exactly like what you say, decided to shape a culture in a certain way, for example, Some concrete examples would be when you look at the culture of a company that isn't exactly transparent in their communication, your first question should be really to ask, is this actually coming from the top? Which means there isn't a concise or clear communication that's coming from the founders, and therefore it didn't cascade down to the rest of the business. And so therefore, as an accumulation, you don't necessarily see a culture of transparency within this business. Now, as the company grows a lot bigger, when we talk about having a second layer of senior management, if not an expansive executive team, you would hope that the lack of from this founder can be passed down, if not be bridged in terms of the gaps by the other executives or the senior management. So then the direct impact becomes a lot less. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if a founder has, say, a lack of strength in communication or communicate transparently or visibly, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in the business will feel this way as the company continues to grow. That's really kind of like the impact that you will see as the company changes its size.
And so if when we talk about maybe somebody who's more in a more recent startup or a smaller size still, what can they do to be laying the foundation so that as they grow, a positive culture will be being built?
Yeah. Do you mean from a founder perspective or an operator perspective? Yeah,
Well,
from a
from the
founder
founder,
perspective.
yeah, from the founder's perspective, what can they be doing? Yeah.
Yeah. So be very intentional about the culture that you want to build. And this is also one of the things that I always tell and coach founders, especially when they kind of think about what is the company that I want to build. Ultimately, the other question to ask is what type of culture and how do I want my people to look, feel, and emote like within the business. That ultimately sets you up for success because you've now got a really good idea about the kind of culture and behaviors that you believe is right for the business. And then you progress along them, which means every step of the way and every action that you then take becomes to usher people towards that direction. And that needs to be very intentional at the early stage.
And I guess how much does it influence when, it's about who you hire versus who you are? Because I just think of maybe a founder knows they lack in a certain area, like a certain soft skill or something, but because of that, they compensate by who they hire. If they're hiring enough people like that, is that the culture then that takes off versus whatever it is, the skill that they are demonstrating?
Absolutely. And that goes back to them being intentional about the culture they actually want to build in the business. And that's why they have enough self-awareness to recognize that this is something that they're lack of. Therefore, they want to compensate, if not find someone who's complementary towards it. And then at the same time, allow that culture to evolve exactly towards the direction that they have set out at the start. And that's why when you meet founders and CEOs who are very intentional about who they're hiring, and sometimes you see them sitting on two polar opposites, and they still complementary work together to build a great organization together, and that's how the organization will evolve.
And so in your opinion then, as the company's growing, how does a founder, one, keep the pulse on the culture, but then two, course correct if there needs to be any course correction?
Yeah, so they need to really be able to be in a position to first empower the people that they hired, right? It's about giving space. Like every manager that we thrive to work for, it's managers who really empower us to kind of allow us to take our own individuality to come to work, which means we can be our true selves. And this exactly applies to the founder as well. As much as they want to build a culture that is a combination of their ideation, they also need to be in the space that allows them to be their individual self. Now, a founder can easily course correct if they have empowered their senior management enough when they know that the feedback that's coming back to them, and now I'm really talking about a much larger organization where they have less control as they used to be when it's only 50 people, right? So we're talking about 200-300 people now, and if there is no empowerment and no accountability in the senior management, then you're not necessarily going to get this feedback loop closed, which means you're not necessarily going to hear firsthand what's happening within the culture or what's happening to the people. And as soon as you hear that, this becomes something sort of a course correction where the founder can then step in to go, this isn't the company I intended to build. then every single department, or if not most of the time, the HR department will then pick up this as an action point to go, how can we resolve this? Because it's directly people related. However, on the other hand, which I've also seen in my experience, if a founder is oblivious or deliberately do not want to address the feedback, or if not the issues that are actually arising, then that very quickly turns into a toxic culture. Again, culture's evolution really comes from the top. And I would always emphasize this, whether it is good or bad, someone needs to take charge at the top of the pyramid.
I've seen companies, in that kind of size that you're talking about where, so maybe the founders left, right? And now we have a new CEO in that organization, and the culture maybe is borderlining on toxic, right? There's just this kind of clickiness where people, if one person says something, everybody's going to back behind that person just because they're the ones who said it, not because it was right. Or nobody wants to change the way things have always been done because, well, it's worked for us in the past, but the past is not necessarily indicative of what will work in the future, right? And it's hard for them to see. So if you're in this type of culture, regardless of what it is that you don't want, right, whatever those characteristics are, how feasible is it to actually change the way that group operates through influence and buy-in versus actually having to let some of those people, like those catalysts, really let them go so that they quit influencing those groups of people? Do you know what I mean? Like whoever it is who's really spearheading that. So what are your thoughts there? Can you do it without kind of removing people from the bus, I guess you could say, or is that really required in order to change the culture?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that it is required to actually remove people per se, because the problem isn't directly related to the people who only want to behave a certain way, right? I think in a lot of ways, when you look into behaviors, especially that is directly related to culture, a lot of that actually has got to do with the ways of working. And when we look into the ways of working, it's an accumulation of, behaviors, the framework that you have in the organization, the tools and the setup of how people are being set up for success or even failure in this point. So I think it's really important to kind of emphasize here that when a situation like this happens, there should always be an intentional change management that goes in, as long as we are aware that a change needs to happen in the culture. Now, not very often you see companies do this, even if they're acutely aware that there is a problem that they need to resolve. Most of the time, they kind of push this down to the bottom of the priority until the bomb takes over, right? And this is unfortunately very, very common in organizations. Now, how we can really look at this is, from a logical point of view, is when you look at transformational projects in the world of IT or tech, there's always a change management plan in place or strategy in place, and that has got immediately to do with the tools, the stack, and the projects alone. But very, very rarely we talk about change management in culture, and this is exactly what needs to happen more and more often in organizations. And you're absolutely right. Even if in this particular scenario, you mentioned that the founder has left and it's a new CEO that has taken place. But it is equally the same as when suddenly the company grows through an immediate hypergrowth, that you suddenly have this new bunch of foreigners or new hires that has come in with a completely different perception as compared to the legacy people that have been working there for a long time. And this is the same scenario that would also require that change management. So if a business is intentional about making culture or supporting the culture to evolve as smoothly as possible, then change management needs to happen. Except that this time we're talking about culture change. Culture change then will have responsibilities of, we'll have owners and responsibilities that actually takes care of identifying what are the no behaviors, what are the yes behaviors, identifying what change has impacted other people and what new changes we expect to see in the future. How do we implement some of these transition in place? Is it via tools? Is it changing the way we work? Is it collecting more feedback? Or maybe there isn't any feedback loop at all to start with. So these are the type of activities that need to happen, rather than saying a founder needs to be a perfect person in order to have a perfect organization. And I think that it's a very, very unfair statement to make on founders. And this is why, a lot of the research that I've done has actually come back to this very same conclusion, that it's quite often that we point the finger back at founders, if not the people or the HR team, when a culture goes into a state where it's unfavorable. But actually, every single person in the organization has equal parts and equal play in building this culture.
And so, what are some of those ways that you can change behaviors? Because, when you talk about IT projects and the change there, it's very like, hey, we've got this new technology. So, this is how our business process changed. Like you said, the way we do our work, it's changing. And it's very targeted to the catalyst of change, right? Which is technology. So, but when you're talking about behavior, like we want to be, let's say, more innovative, or we want to be more internally collaborative or more problem solving. How do you approach change on those softer skills?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. It's almost like, sometimes I'm sure there's an individual that sits at their desk and suddenly they go, I think that I've got some bad behaviors. How do I go about starting this change journey? And it all starts from being able to actually recognize, right? Have the awareness of what are the bad behaviors that we absolutely do not want in this organization. It's the same applies to an individual who's sitting out there thinking, these are some of the bad habits that I do not want to have anymore because it's limiting my progress. It is limiting the success that I desire to have. So you apply that into an organization. Ask the question around what are the goals that we're trying to achieve? What are we actually trying to achieve, giving our customers? And what are our limitations? And as soon as you're able to recognize that some of the limitations are impacted or brought upon by our people and behaviors, you pinpoint them and you course correct them. And this is why I also mentioned things around, making sure that there are enough support system tools and actually have almost like a task force to be able to implement and drive some of these things forward, right? Because it's not in the top of your head to be able to go, today I'm coming into work as a different version of myself. That's not natural. But most of the time we come into work wanting the organization to give us direction of what good looks like, or if not, our managers to tell us some things need to change in our performance, if not our behavior. So if we heavily rely on the next person to tell us what we need to be doing in order to improve ourselves, then ultimately this also needs to be applied back into the organization. And this is why every time I'm in a situation where I'm asked for this advice, I immediately tell them that they need to put a task force together to actually identify where the change needs to happen.
And so what would your recommendation then be for somebody with a small company, let's say 10 people, right? Still, like you said, in that position where the culture is very naturally an extension of the founder. What would your recommendation be for that founder to be putting in place and continuing to put in place as the company scales in order to keep the culture on the right track?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I love this question. So first off, I would say founders, please start by first having the self-awareness of where you think your own lack of is, and then making sure that people around the table have the ability to bridge those gaps, because you want to be able to create a wholesome business, right? We all want to work with people of different kinds and shapes and form. And so therefore, this needs to happen from the top, and it needs to start from the top when it cascades down. Then the second thing is make sure as a founder as well to really empower the other individuals that are also equally contributing just as much to shape the culture as you desire. Because it's also very common to find a founder who goes, yes, I've hired all these people who can bridge a lot of these gaps, but I'm not necessarily comfortable in letting go. And that's when the empowerment stops. So that really needs to happen, because you can't do it all on your own. It's the same thing that I've described earlier is, they can't be the point of failure and success of the entire business. They require the people around them. So this is the same concept that applies to the senior management or anybody around the table that are tasked to really kind of shape the culture together, and they need to be able to be given that space and success for it.
Yep, no, that makes sense. And so let's go to the flip side then. What are some of the biggest mistakes you've seen then that then create the failure points in these organizations? Like what are the gotchas?
Yeah. So it comes down to this. A lot of the times what I've seen are founders not necessarily wanting to let go of control. They see control as the only mechanism to have a pulse on the organization. But, as you live through your career, you know that there are different ways of actually checking a pulse on the organization. When they have this huge misperception of control equals to pulse, that's when a lot of people aren't able to be put up for success. So, for example, I'm sure any person that you ask out there would not want to go into an organization to completely lose their identity or their individuality. Everybody comes to work wanting to be the best version of themselves. Now, if an organization does not have the space and capability to allow you to do that, then it's very likely for it to fail. And this is where we call it a culture fail.
Okay. And then is there a point where the culture gets so bad that there's no turning it around?
Yeah, I love this question. I've got founders that really ask me, is this too late now? My straight answer is it's never too late. But there is a lot of work to be done, if not more, if it has gone down a really deep road.
And so what does it look like digging it out? Like what are some of those, here's the first thing you need to do, or here's the fundamentals to make that. I mean, I know we talked about a little bit with these change committees or whatever, task force, but really what are kind of those key things that you're going to have to do to get through it?
Yeah. First things first is to first identify again what is the culture that the company desired to build in the first place, and where have we gone wrong. Start doing some sort of post-mortem to recognize where the failures were, what did we not do well as what are some of the bad behaviors right now that are completely non-negotiable, and immediately put a stop to it. And that's okay. It's the same as managers having a conversation with an individual to go, I'm now giving you feedback. I've noticed some of these behaviors, and they are actually non-negotiable as part of the company that we're trying to build. And I would like you to stop doing this from now on. How can I help you to do that? It's the same conversation that a founder needs to be having together with the organization. But again, the emphasis here is to not have the founders think that they need to do this all by themselves. They need to be able to bring the other people on the journey together with them, so that the evolution towards better is a collaboration.
And what if I know I'm an employee and I know I'm part of a bad culture? How do I influence or open the eyes of maybe the founder who doesn't know it?
Yeah, it's a tough one, to be honest. It's a really tough one. I've asked this question many times as well. There are two ways of looking at this, I would say, honestly. If you are an operator right now and you feel that the layers above you and the environment around you does not actually equip a good feedback loop, which means no matter how many times you've said this or put this out there, it feels like it's falling on deaf ears, then I think it's time to call it a day. Because when I say it's time to call it a day, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to quit your job and move on and find a better environment, which ultimately you should, because you should be in an environment that actually promotes your success rather than stunts your success. But on the other hand, it also means to go into a stage where you accept these are the behaviors that I will continue to see, and how do I go about navigating myself through it? It really depends on the individual. But on the other hand, if there is a chance where you feel this feedback is going somewhere. However, in many instances, I feel that my manager hears me. My manager is trying to make these small changes to make our lives a little bit better. However, I feel like my manager doesn't have enough autonomy to then bring these feedback up another layer to make a much more wider organizational change. That's when I hope there is an opportunity in this organization to go, let's create an employee feedback platform. how can we surface more of these feedback into a higher level where either it becomes anonymized, but it is also taken more seriously. So really try and navigate to find different types of way to leave this feedback into a more effective channel.
And I guess any words of advice for friends in HR, because I think oftentimes, HR realizes that it's an important, aspect and it's something to pay attention, but it's hard to influence maybe anybody else to pay attention to it. Any recommendations for them?
Yeah, absolutely. First things first, as a HR person to another HR person, is to say that don't try to tackle this all on your own and feel like you're completely guilty, or if not, you're the point of success or failure when a culture doesn't evolve into the state that you want it to, because it's a very, very common misperception that this is entirely HR's job. So it's really important to immediately recognize that this is not, your sole responsibility. Now, in a lot of organizations that I have seen work really well in developing a great culture, HR has always been working in parallel, if not in tandem, with the CEOs, or if not with the founders, right? It's almost like the founders have a desire, HR is the team to execute and implement, but that desire needs to come from somewhere, but it also needs to be aligned to the other aspirations. So that would be my first advice to HR folks.
And what about, I guess, thinking about change and stuff, I think, do you see value in the how to do the what's in it for me, right? Can HR customize those messages to those other leaders about like what they're going to get out of a culture change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great responsibility for HR to have, only because they're, in a lot of ways, HR is probably the only team that actually has direct ties to each and every element, or if not every corner of the organization. So this becomes, our superpower to be able to pass that message on. And in reality, it's really to frame the narrative as what's in it for you is a better organization means you've got to manage less people problems as a manager. We are going to deliver better products to our customers. We are going to have a much healthier working environment, if not a scalable environment, and everybody wins. It just has to be something that is quite natural to be applied to all parts of the business. It cannot be an isolated problem. And this is, again, one of the problems that I've always seen in different companies when they have a misperception of what culture truly means and how to course correct when there's a cultural problem, is they think that it's an isolated problem.
Well, Sophie, this has been a really great conversation. What three things do you want to leave top of mind with our audience?
Yeah. Well, first things first is culture continues to evolve. Never think that culture stops at any one point in time. That's the most important thing, whether you're an operator or a leader. The second thing would be, again, back to culture, it really is a collaboration with every single person in the business. If you are a person in the business right now, you should know that you have equal parts to play in forming a great culture if you so much desire to be working in a great culture. And the third thing is really a message to leave with founders, and that is to not think that you need to tackle this all on your own.
No, it's great. And how can folks learn more about, your research? And I think you said you had a book. Where can they get in touch with you and find out more?
Yeah, for sure. So I've got a website. It's just my first name, last name. So www.sophietheen.com. My book is there. My book's been recently published. It's also been picked up by Forbes. It's really a message to send to founders that their very actions impacts the entirety of their business in terms of culture. And it's called The Soul of Startups.
Oh, well, that's awesome. Well, thanks so much for being a guest today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy. Hey!